Hi, everybody. It turns out that Jessica Friedman will be going before Rebecca Margolick after I speak. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Doug. When I learned last year that the Conney conference was coming to the Y, the opportunity to initiate this first, and I hope not last, group of archive fellows proved irresistible, and I'm grateful to him and the conference organizers for embracing the idea. In recent months, the three fellows, Lauren Strauss, who presented on Sunday, and Jessica and Rebecca, whose work you're about to experience, have done extensive research in the Y's archive, and I'm as excited as you are to learn more about what they have discovered or rediscovered, as is often the case with an institution as august as the 92nd Street Y. That the Y has an archive whose richness and accessibility strives to keep pace with the institution's vivid ongoingness, its everyday history in the making, is the legacy of our founding archivist, Steve Siegel, a legendary figure in the field who passed away a few years ago and whose name still rings out. May these introductory remarks be a tribute to his enduring contribution, and as a further invocation, a short passage from Henry James's preface to the Aspirin Papers, where James writes, "Table, you might substitute performance spaces such as this one and the stage in the concert hall downstairs, sites of cultural memory whose floorboards are not so much haunted by history as hum along with it. I delight in a palpable, imaginable, visitable past, in the nearer distances and the clearer mysteries, the marks and signs of a world we may reach over to, as by making a long arm we grasp an object at the other end of a table. The table is the one, the common expanse, and where we lean, so stretching, we find it firm and continuous. That, to my imagination, is the past fragrant of all, or of almost all, the poetry of the thing outlived and lost and gone, and yet in which the precious element of closeness, telling so of connections, but tasting so of differences, remains appreciable. We are divided, of course, between liking to feel the past strange and liking to feel it familiar. The difficulty is, for intensity, to catch it at the moment when the scales of the balance hang with the right evenness. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Friedman.
Thank you. And a particular thank you to Bernard for all of his generosity and assistance in my research process. On January 19th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin returned home from their second meeting in Yalta, in which they discussed plans for the final phase of World War II. Working women in the United States filled roles left by men away at war. Jim Crow laws raged in the United States South, leading some, including African-American dancer and choreographer Pearl Primus, to compare it to Nazi Germany. At the same time, the 92nd Street YMYWHA in Manhattan turned its Shabbat service over to Reverend Ben Richardson, an African-American preacher. Perhaps as members of the Reformed congregation sat down, they recalled how the Y Bulletin, the Y's weekly member newsletter, had noted earlier that week that, quote, his pragmatic approach to religion marks Reverend Richardson as today's outstanding liberal in the Negro pulpit, end quote, and that he, quote, has been in the forefront of the clergy's relentless war against anti-Semitism as the prime weapon of fascism, common weapon of the Negro and the Jew, end quote. Maybe they put his sermon into relation with other Y happenings. Its ongoing race and culture lecture series interrogated and educated on anti-Semitism, racism, and ways to combat prejudice. Similarly, the Langston Hughes poetry reading, held in conjunction with one of Primus's dance recitals, had articulated these issues through art a year earlier. Or maybe their minds wandered 2 days ahead, as they made plans to attend Sophie Maslow's Folk Say that Sunday in Kaufman Auditorium, which critics had noted used an interracial cast of Jewish and African-American dancers. Whatever the congregation was thinking, all of these happenings were intermixing in the space of the Y. These modes of creating space and solidarity for minoritized subjects hung in the air. Many minoritized subjects who experienced the Y during the 1940s described it as a haven from discriminatory practices, positioning it as a common space. Maslow, with their 1942 Folksay, which had its concert hall debut at the Y, and Primus, with their 1943 Parttime Blues, which premiered at the Y, resonated with, engaged, and debated this sense of common space. Folksay incorporated Jewish and African American bodies into American folk idioms. Parttime Blues articulated the exclusion of African Americans from economic prosperity. Drawing from the Y's archives and building upon dance scholar Naomi Jackson's account of modern dance at the Y, I posit that Maslow and Primus used choreographic strategies that enabled them to exhibit virtuosity in such a way that intervened in what dance scholar Ellen Graff refers to as, quote, notions of what the American people represented as an imagined cultural entity during the emergence of the United States of world power, end quote, in the 1930s through 1950s. While critics understood the messages of Folksay and Parttime Blues, they neatly tied those messages to descriptions of virtuosity. In the case of Folksay, virtuosity was tied to ideas of Americanness and the individual greatness of Maslow. For Parttime Blues, virtuosity was tied to Primus's blackness and attributed to an ostensibly essential dance talent. How did the inclusive, yet still Jewish, site of the Y foster an atmosphere in which these two works were consistently read in terms of those notions of virtuosity? I interrogate the possibilities and limits the Y fostered for the interventions of Maslow and Primus. In a move afforded by the majority of her dancers' Ashkenazi paleness, Maslow, I contend, intervened in a homogeneous white settler America while galvanizing its whiteness. In the case of Primus's intervention, I argue that the logic of the 1940s Y rendered her dancing body as readily viewed in terms of blackness, labor, and virtuosity. In the context of mid-20th century American modern dance, I consider virtuosity as comprised of choreography, performance, and reception. Choreographic strategies that allow for display of technical ability must be deployed in order for the audience to readily view the dancers in terms of virtuosity. The dancers then take up the opportunities the choreography allows by moving in such a way that demands spectators to contemplate their physical power. I use reception of the dancers and choreographers I study in order to assess virtuosity both in terms of how particular movement qualities read as virtuosic were deployed by the artists, as well as how those interacted with the spaces in which they were situated. This allows me to account for the situatedness and constructedness of notions of virtuosity as dependent upon race, gender, time, and space. Folksay is a collection of short dances accompanied by the folk music of Woody Guthrie and narration of Carl Sandburg's poem, The People, Yes. As it was performed throughout the 1940s, often at the Y, different excerpts of the work were occasionally omitted. However, it consistently included On Top of Old Smoky, a female solo Maslow created for herself to the folk song of that title. Although Maslow did not medically represent the words of the songs or the poetry, the thematic content, soundscape, and costumes led the work to convey a sense of a distinctly white, rural American culture that brought critics to consistently phrase their reviews in terms of America and an American culture. Maslow walks into her solo slowly from off stage in her bare feet, light-colored dress, and kerchief. Once standing on center, she reaches her arms overhead and clasps her hands together as she slowly maneuvers her torso through all directions of the space. To the ground, the side, back as far as she can bend, the other side, and back to the ground. She ruptures the harmony between her smooth movements and the mesmerizing ease of the song's melody when she sharply steps to brush a leg up high to the front and then use that momentum to launch into a run across the stage. The tension between adhering to the music's sounds and incorporating her ambiguous interpretations of them is noted by dance writer and critic Margaret Lloyd in her 1949 Borzai Book of Modern Dance. Lloyd describes Folksay as a classic and as Maslow's greatest work, while also asserting that Maslow, quote, makes no attempt to be authentic, but uses the material creatively, end quote. There's a tension between individual excellence and adhering to the theme evoked by the music and costumes. Despite this ambivalence between representation and abstraction, Maslow's centering of the female dancing body carried through to an implicit centering of woman in the role of the country in modern dance for New York Times dance critic John Martin. He wrote in regards to the piece that despite, quote, war taking most of the men away, American dance has reached a wonderfully adult level, and its vitality is such that in spite of hardships and disappointed hopes, which the war has brought upon it at a critical phase of its life, it will pull itself through and carry on, end quote. Ideas of women fulfilling crucial roles in propelling time, dance, and the country forward were constituted on stage through dance. As her abstract take on folk material disorients the sounds it dances with and clothing it dances in, Maslow similarly uses spatial patterns. She charts the stage by dancing in a multitude of disorienting diagonal lines. The series of diagonals begins as she moves from corner to corner by stepping into an arabesque, only to twist through the space as she does a fouette, switching her body position so her leg is in front of her instead of behind. She makes progress along her diagonal by moving forward, and backward. The spectators are commanded to watch her display of mobility, but their eyes cannot rest as she will not settle into a single direction. For Martin, this qualifies the piece to be characterized as, quote, sheer poetry, end quote. In describing her dancing as poetry, he renders it in terms of a typically individually constructed art form and as possessing an individual aesthetic. This individual emphasis signals a way in which the work was coded as white. Whereas Martin reviewed African-American dancers affiliated with the New Dance Group, a modern dance group of which Maslow and Primus were key members, as necessarily representative of their race, Maslow is afforded the position of an individual artist. Folksay concludes with a short finale in which all of the dancers walk in small groupings in diagonal and spiraling patterns across the stage. This section brought forth the most commentary on the work's interracial casting. While Folksay resonated with calls for solidarity amongst Jews and African Americans at the Y, it whitened the Jewish bodies in such a way that further differentiated black bodies, even as they all performed the same choreography. For instance, Ruth Selden, writing for the Daily Worker, describes, quote, the dark form of Pearl Primus moving in perfect accord with her lighter sisters and brothers, end quote. The apparent need to emphasize Primus's ability to move in sync with the Jewish dancers evidences a presumption that her body is incommensurable with their lighter bodies. In the diagonals of her solo and intricate walking patterns at the finale, Maslow might be moving in simple directions, but she shakes up those directions in such a way that her impact on them cannot be ignored. She galvanizes a sense of rural whiteness as standing in for America, while also intervening in that by drawing attention to bodies for whom Americanness was not a simple guarantee at the time. Vivian Shapiro, a Jewish member of the Y writing for its member bulletin, gestured to this when she noted that Maslow, quote, dipped into the overflowing material of our vast cultural heritage, and out of this she has evolved something so exciting and solid, end quote. In this review, there's a collapsing of the Ashkenazi Jewish hour with the white rural America Folksay conveyed. Even as the work used an interracial cast, its thematic content, soundscape, costumes, and the paleness of its majority Ashkenazi dancers obscured some of its intervention in discourse on race and inclusion. This interaction led the work to be coded as virtuosic in a distinctly white way. Moreover, I argue, it was the whiteness of this virtuosity that brought about reception in which Maslow and her dancers were counted in a sense of an American cultural identity, however imagined and illusory that may be. In other words, virtuosity acts in folksay as a mechanism through which bodies are included into a sense of a larger whole, but both that whole and those bodies are distinctly constituted via dance as white. In addition to dancing in folksay, Primus regularly performed recitals at the Y that concluded with pieces she characterized as protest dances. Parttime Blues was a part of this category and protested the conditions of African American sharecroppers in the Jim Crow-plagued South. Primus begins Parttime Blues by sprinting on stage and then abruptly halting and contracting her torso. She's corporeally impacted by the space as a record of blues singer Josh White's song, Parttime Blues, plays. This sense of energetic contrast created by her entrance continues throughout the piece as she moves from swaying in place as though gently blowing in a breeze to forcefully running in intricate spatial patterns. Dizzying turns give way to easy waltz steps, and sky-high jumps lead to deep lunges. In her review of the piece, Nora Holt, dance critic for the New York Amsterdam News, attempts to capture this sense of intractable play with dynamics. She writes that, quote, "The amazement of her dancing is the juxtaposition of heavy and light shading. While she displays great strength and energy, there's also a lightness and feathery movement of torso, which excites attention and injects the element of surprise into her interpretations," end quote. In this comment, Holt takes Primus's strength for granted and emphasizes the shock that her ability to dance lightly. The strength and energy convey Primus's labor as an essential trait that is not noteworthy. The lightness and feathery movement, however, are taken as an indication of a great technical ability, as a form of virtuosity that is awe-inducing. Of all the amazement-eliciting movements she dances in Parttime Blues, a recurring jumping phrase that Primus describes as, quote, "a projection of defiance or desperation," unquote, is most consistently noted in reviews. From the back corner of the stage, she lunges low to the ground only to take off running across the floor. She erupts into the air while her legs are still running. The air becomes her earth as she hovers between the ground and sky. Or, as Lloyd describes this moment, quote, "It is phenomenal for its excursions into space and stopovers on top of it," end quote. When Primus returns to the earth, she disorients the straight diagonal line in which she had been traveling by spiraling into a pirouette that chisels into the air. She launches out of the turn into a series of quick jumps, in which her body makes the shape of the letter C in the air. The air between the ground and ceiling in Kaufman Auditorium and the remains of events such as Hughes's poetry reading, Reverend Richardson's sermons and lectures, or the Race and Culture lecture series that took place at the Y during World War II and hung in that air, become the space in which Primus dances sharecroppers into the conversations had at the Y. Primus concludes Parttime Blues by methodically walking towards the audience. Dancer and dance historian Joe Nash describes this moment in an oral history by noting that, quote, "She approaches the audience as if to say, give me food, give me shelter, give me something, and that was a very impressive moment," end quote. In this impressive moment, Primus does not ask, but demands room in the American economic system. In contrast to patriotic rhetoric of the country coming together during World War II, she articulates the exclusion of African American sharecroppers from an ostensible sense of an American economic commons. The interconnection between Primus's virtuosity and this particular intervention is gestured toward in Martin's review of the piece, when he relates her ability to, quote, "command attention," end quote, to what he phrases as the fact that she has, quote, "technical capacity, compositional skill, and something to say," end quote. His comment succinctly ties together notions of labor, choreographic and performance virtuosity, and a political intervention, all of which held particular import at the Y through its programming and progressive humanistic logic. Lloyd accounts for a sense of labor present in the logic of the Y under William Kolodny, its education director from 1935 through 1969. She describes a conversation she had with Kolodny, writing that, quote, "You cannot eliminate effort from the appreciation of modern dance chamber music, or poetry, he says. And he is right. The true artist never finishes a sentence. You finish it, end quote. In this logic, the labor of the spectator is crucial. As perceptions of Primus's labor are considered in relation to her wowing dances, utmost physical strength, and technical acumen, she is marked not only by her labor, but by her particularly extraordinary or virtuosic labor. As issues surrounding ethnicity, race, and intolerance were of crucial importance for the wise logic, the work required to learn about these and improve the lived experiences of Jews and African Americans was foregrounded. At the same time, the modern dance stage at the Y lived in tandem with these concerns and added the element of virtuosity. In addition to a dancer's political and cultural thoughts and messages, her capacity for apparently difficult or extraordinary feats was to be taken into consideration. These different elements came together in the Y for its audiences and rendered Primus as readily viewed in terms of her race and physical prowess. Virtuosity entails tension. As Maslow maneuvers between traveling on a straight diagonal and twisting and turning her body in space, Primus negotiates between the air and the ground. Sometimes that tension also exists between the world created by the performance and the outside world. These pieces did not fundamentally alter the lived experiences of Jews or African Americans. Often, reviews were framed in terms of racial essentialisms that belied some of the more radical work the dancers were doing. By drawing attention to corporeality via virtuosity, Maslow and Primus dance interventions in tension with the spaces in which they were situated. The space of the Y, with its rhetoric of interracial and interethnic inclusivity, as well as urban constituency, is in tension with Maslow's whitewashing of bodies into a rural white America, and Primus's articulation of the continued exclusion of African Americans from economic prosperity. The space of American modern dance, with its universalist abstraction, is in tension with Maslow's distinctly rural folks and Primus's African American sharecropper. Perhaps producing and sustaining these tensions is the most virtuosic feat of the pieces. Thank you.